Imagine an old warrior, already over 80 years old, riding his horse in the middle of a field, covered in dust and corpses. He does not back down. He does not beg for leniency. Antigonus the One-Eyed, with only one eye, but sharper vision than all of Alexander's other generals, faces death as if it were another enemy to be defeated. And on that day, even surrounded by war elephants, by an entire coalition, even betrayed and crushed, he fought as if he could still conquer the world. This is not just another general forgotten by history. This is the man who almost rebuilt Alexander's empire with his own hands. You will now understand why his name still echoes among the giants. Even before Alexander dreamed of conquering the world, Antigonus was already marching on the trails of glory. It didn't come out of nowhere. The son of a nobleman named Philip, his origin was Macedonian, but his destiny seemed shaped by the gods of war. The ancient sources reveal little about his youth, but one thing is clear. Antigonus was not just another soldier. He breathed strategy. He lived for the battlefield. By the time of Philip II, Alexander's father, Antigonus, had already shown his military genius and a rare sense of loyalty. While others sought prestige, he collected victories and respect. He served in several campaigns for domination of Greece, and on Philip's death, his allegiance was transferred without hesitation to the young Alexander. But not just any subordinate. Antigonus would become a silent pillar of Macedonian expansion, a shadow with a sword in his hands and plans in his head. When Alexander crossed Asia Minor, Antigonus was one of the first to set foot on enemy soil, and he never backed down. With each city conquered, with each people subjugated, there was the invisible trace of Antigonus's strategic intelligence. So it was that he quietly began to forge his own path, a path that would one day threaten to swallow the entire empire. While the names of Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Hephaestion echoed in royal halls and imperial banquets, Antigonus preferred the silence of military tents and the smell of earth mixed with blood. He was part of the Hetairoi, Alexander's inner circle of generals. But unlike the others, he did not seek cuddles from the king, but territory, command, and control. He was the kind of man who saw opportunity where others saw only combat. During the campaigns in Asia Minor, Antigonus was tasked with quelling revolts and consolidating newly conquered regions. It was no easy task. Proud peoples, ancient cultures, and resentments against the Macedonians turned every city into a cauldron waiting to explode. But he didn't just maintain order, he commanded respect. In Phrygia and Lydia, two crucial regions, Antigonus acted as a true uncrowned king. He commanded troops, organized tributes, maintained diplomacy with local leaders, and executed anyone who threatened the peace. His authority grew so much that he began to arouse fears. But Alexander, intelligent and calculating, knew he needed men like him, loyal, cruel when necessary, and fully capable of ruling away from the king's shadow. Antigonus was this rare kind of commander, one who could be left alone for months, and upon his return, the territory would not only be at peace, but richer, more armed, more ready for war. It was during this period that he stopped being just an executor of orders and began to shape his own destiny. His eyes were on something greater than the victory of an empire. He wanted to build his own. And if you've made it this far, you've noticed, this isn't just another old story. It is the raw and fascinating portrait of a man who refused to live in the shadow of others and decided to build his own empire. If this kind of narrative hooks you, if Antigonus's quiet courage made you reflect, then you are part of the small group of people who value true history, the one that few know about, but that transforms our view of the world. So, leave your like now. It shows the algorithm that this content deserves to reach more like-minded people. And subscribe to the channel, because in the next stories, we'll continue to dig deep revealing forgotten names, hidden strategies, and battles that have shaped our present, and that most have never heard of. You are already part of something bigger, and this is just the beginning. When Alexander died suddenly in 323 BC, the world trembled. The generals clashed, the soldiers were orphaned, and the conquered cities were in suspense. Who would take over the empire that stretched from Greece to the banks of the Indus? There was no clear successor. And it was in this power vacuum that Antigonus emerged, not as an heir, but as a predator. While others discussed sharing in halls, Antigonus was already organizing troops, reinforcing fortresses, and sending spies. During the partition of Babylon, the empire was divided among the generals, the Diadochi, and Phrygia was assigned to him. But Antigonus did not see Phrygia as a prize. He saw it as the starting point. It was a strategically located territory with abundant resources and valuable trade routes. And there he began to draw the map of his future empire, with the authority of one who had already commanded entire regions under Alexander. Antigonus refused to be treated as an equal to the other generals. For him, that empire should not be divided. It should be reconquered by someone on a par with the former king, someone like him. From that moment on, Antigonus was no longer just an efficient administrator. He became the architect of a silent war. While feigning cooperation with the other Diadochi, he armed the provinces, established alliances, suppressed rebellions, and eliminated local rivals. His dominance in Asia Minor grew like a cancer, silent, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Antigonus's ambition was no secret, but no one knew yet how far he was willing to go to become the new master of the Hellenistic world. Alexander's empire had turned into an arena of hungry lions, and Antigonus was preparing to make the first move. In 320 BC, just 3 years after Alexander's death, the first war of the Diadochi broke out. The official reason? Disputes over territories. The truth? Everyone wanted to be the new Alexander, and Antigonus of all was the most dangerous. Ptolemy, who had settled in Egypt, and Seleucus, who had taken over Babylon, soon realized that Antigonus was not an ally. He was a growing threat. With his firm grip on Phrygia, he began to extend his dominions across Asia Minor, occupying cities, quelling rebellions, and ignoring any order that did not come from himself. He didn't just resist the impositions of the other generals, he began to actively challenge their decisions. Seleucus, perceiving the relentless advance of Antigonus, fled from Babylon and took refuge with Ptolemy. The war was launched. Antigonus demonstrated tactics of genius. He did not face his rivals in the open field immediately. First, it undermined their supply routes. He bribed allies. He surrounded fortresses with feline patience. When he finally attacked, he did so with surgical brutality. He established himself not as a defender of Alexander's inheritance, but as a usurper of an invisible throne. He didn't call himself king yet, but he acted like one. He issued orders, minted coins, and made alliances as if the empire were rightfully his. The Hellenistic world realized Antigonus was not interested in maintaining Alexander's legacy. He wanted to erase the traces of the dead king and write a new story, with his own name at the top. While the other Diadochi vied for small victories and fragile alliances, Antigonus expanded his influence in a methodical and deadly way. He didn't ask permission, he did. Their armies marched like swarms, and their power grew like a shadow over the whole east of the empire. Before long, Antigonus controlled not only Phrygia, but vast areas of Asia Minor, as far as Syria and Mesopotamia. It was in the midst of this fulminating rise that, in 306 BC, Antigonus decided to break the last veil of modesty. He proclaimed himself King of Asia. It wasn't just a provocation. It was a declaration of war against all his rivals. He was no longer content to be an influential general. Now he assumed the crown that Alexander had dropped, and he did it with the certainty that he had the strength to support her. This boldness did not go unanswered. The other Diadochus, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander understood that if they did not join forces, Antigonus would devour the Hellenistic world city by city, kingdom by kingdom. They then formed a coalition with a single goal: to overthrow the new king before it was too late. Antigonus, on the other hand, was not intimidated. He sent his son Demetrius, known as the Poliorcetes, the taker of cities, to lead campaigns in the Greek regions and maintain pressure on the enemy's coalition's strategic points. The war was intensifying on several fronts. At that time, Antigonus was more than a veteran general. It was the symbol of the continuity of an empire, the living embodiment of Alexander's ambition. But the winds were changing, and the price of his boldness was approaching. The declaration of Antigonus as king of Asia was the fuse of a war of colossal proportions. For the first time, the Diadochi, who had hitherto fought each other over pieces of the empire, united with a common purpose: to overthrow the old general who had dared to declare himself sovereign. Cassander, lord of Macedonia, Lysimachus, king of Thrace, Ptolemy, consolidated in Egypt, and Seleucus, increasingly powerful in Babylon, all saw in Antigonus a real threat to their own political survival. Thus was born the Second War of the Diadochi, a tense but extremely dangerous alliance. Antigonus, at the height of his 80 years, did not back down. On the contrary, he reorganized his forces, strengthened his territories, and continued to send Demetrius on daring campaigns through Greece, where he conquered cities and crushed resistance. Father and son, separated by generations, but united by the same ambition to rebuild the world in their own way, seemed unstoppable. But the coalition forces were immense, and they were moving. The siege was closing in on Phrygia, the heart of Antigonus's power. The military movement of his enemies was coordinated, strategic, calculated to attack from all flanks. Lysimachus invaded Asia Minor from the north. Seleucus descended on the east, bringing with him a decisive trump card: war elephants, a devastating weapon inherited from Alexander's eastern campaigns. Even in the face of this overwhelming threat, Antigonus stood firm. The battle that was approaching was not just for territory, it was for history, for the right to be remembered as the one who continued what Alexander began. Antigonus knew that the last war was coming, and he intended to face it head-on. The year was 301 BC element. The place, Ipsus, in the region of Phrygia. The forces were gathered. On one side, Antigonus and his son Demetrius, leading a still formidable, experienced and loyal army. On the other, a coalition of 4 kings, united by fear and ambition: Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus, the latter bringing with him more than 400 war elephants, a resource that would change the fate of that day. Antigonus, even in his 80s, rode his horse like an ordinary soldier. He rejected the comfort of a portable throne. He rejected the idea of waiting for news in safety. He wanted to be on the front lines, looking into the eyes of those who dared to challenge his right to the crown. The battle began with brutal violence. Demetrius led the cavalry with an almost mythical fury, breaching the enemy lines. For hours, it looked like the old general might win, but luck and strategy were on the other side. Seleucus, with surgical precision, launched the elephants to block Demetrius's cavalry. Isolated, he was unable to return to support his father, and Antigonus, without reinforcements, was exposed in the center of the field. The enemies advanced like a sea of spears. A well-aimed blow pierced his armor, another pierced his leg. But he didn't fall. He fought standing until the last moment. And then a projectile, perhaps a spear, perhaps an arrow, finally knocked him down. There, on the blood-stained ground, the last giant of Alexander's generation died, not with a whisper, but with a roar that would echo in history. When Antigonus's body fell at Ipsus, the battlefield was silent for a brief moment. It was as if even the elephants had stopped to recognize the fall of one of the greatest warriors of the Hellenistic era. The death of that man, old, hardened, but immensely feared, marked the end of Alexander's ambitions for the reunification of the empire. No other general would dare to try to restore the entirety of the empire anymore. With Antigonus dead, the dream of a unified Macedonia crumbled like dust in the wind. What remained were independent kingdoms, fragments of a broken colossus: Egypt with Ptolemy, Babylon with Seleucus, Thrace with Lysimachus, Macedonia with Cassander. Everyone could now breathe a sigh of relief. The old Titan had fallen, but his death did not mean the end of his legacy. Demetrius I, his son, survived the battle and escaped with part of the troops. And although defeated, he did not bow down. Demetrius inherited not only the name of Antigonus, but his flame, a flame that, even staggering, still threatened to rekindle the ambition of domination. Antigonus did not die as a traitor or coward. He died as he lived, fighting to the end. And when he fell, he left behind a legend. His enemies feared him not only for his sword, but for his sight. He had looked at the map of the world and believed that he could shape it with his own hands. Therefore, even dead, his name was whispered for generations, not like the man who failed to unite the empire, but as one who dared to try. With the death of Antigonus at Ipsus, the enemy kingdoms celebrated his victory. But this peace would be brief. From the ashes of defeat emerged Demetrius I, nicknamed Poliorcetes, or the Taker of Cities, a warrior as ambitious as his father, a strategist who did not know the meaning of surrender. Demetrio didn't just survive, he fought back. He reorganized his armies, gathered allies, and launched new campaigns across Greece. He conquered Athens, besieged Rhodes, and for a time it seemed that he would restore the empire of the Antigonids. His reputation as a siege master made him feared, and his ability to maneuver in battle kept alive the hope that his father's dynasty would not fall by the wayside. But, like his father, Demetrio also faced a world of fragile alliances and constant betrayals. The other rival houses saw in him the same spirit as Antigonus, and so they tried to stop him before it was too late. There were periods when he lost everything, even his freedom, and was arrested and held captive. But the dynasty did not die with him. It was his son, Antigonus II Gonatas, who would finally consolidate the throne of Macedonia decades later, continuing the legacy started by that man who died fighting at the age of 80. The name Antigonus would still echo for generations, not just as a general or king, but as the symbol of a bloodline that refused to be forgotten. The Antigonid dynasty, even fragmented, would profoundly mark the history of the Hellenistic world. For where others saw defeat, the sons of Antigonus saw continuation. Antigonus was not just a general, not just a king. He was a force of nature in human form, a man who stood up to the greatest leaders of his day, not with titles, but with vision, courage, and strategy. He was not born with Alexander's glory, but dared to try to be greater than him. His body fell at Ipsus, but his ideas survived in the foundations of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the organization of the provinces, the administration of vast territories, the fusion of military culture with politics. All this had in Antigonus one of its greatest architects. He didn't just march with Alexander, he helped build the world that Alexandra dreamed of. And when that world collapsed, he was the only one who tried to rebuild it with his own hands. His trajectory is the portrait of the man who defies the impossible, who fights until the last second, even when fate has already been sealed, that does not bow to old age, fear, or death. And perhaps in the end, that's why his name still stands the test of time. Because history does not only remember those who win, it bows before those who fight to the end for an ideal. If this video made you see Antigonus with new eyes, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with those who need. To remember that true greatness is not in conquering the world, but in never stopping fighting for it. If this story touched you in any way, if Antigonus, with his disciplined vision and solitary courage, made you look at life with different eyes, then I ask you something simple but powerful. This content was created with a single purpose: to transform forgotten information into living inspiration. If this gave you value, reciprocate with a like. It's not just a click, it's a sign that it's worth continuing to dig up those stories that no one else tells. And if you felt like you learned something today, if something has changed inside you, then subscribe to the channel now. Because here, every video is made to bring about transformation. It's not just about history, it's about seeing the strength of those who came before and letting it awaken the warrior in you. You are not here by chance. It's here because something in you also wants to leave a mark, and the journey has barely begun.